It was late evening when Javier, Maria, and Luis were having dinner. The laughter of their son filled the air, a sound of pure innocence and joy. But outside, the world was a different story. In the distance, a police cruiser sped down the road. Inside the vehicle, Officer Jameson, a young cop in his early 30s, was speaking into the radio.
"All units, be on the lookout for a robbery suspect," he announced.
Male, 5'9", dark hair, wearing a gray hoodie, possible Latino. Javier, oblivious to the danger, stood up from the dinner table to clean the dishes. His mind was far from trouble. He had no idea that just moments away, his life would be torn apart. As Javier walked out onto the sidewalk towards his house, he didn't notice the police cruiser slowing as it passed by. Officer Jameson, his eyes scanning the street, took notice of Javier's figure in a gray hoodie. For a fleeting moment, something about Javier struck him as suspicious. He glanced at his radio, then back at the man walking innocently toward his home.
"What are the odds?"
Officer Jameson muttered under his breath. With no reason but a hunch, Jameson hit the sirens. The cruiser screeched to a stop. A signal to his fellow officers. Something wasn't right. Within seconds, multiple police cars appeared, screeching to a halt around Javier's house. Officers spilled out, weapons drawn, shouting commands at the man who stood still, confused, in his front yard. "Freeze! Hands in the air!" they commanded. Javier, startled and unsure of what was happening, instinctively raised his hands, trying to show that he meant no harm. But his confusion, his hesitation, and the way he reached for his pocket to grab his phone made it all too easy for the officers to misread the situation. They didn't wait for clarification. They saw a man making a sudden movement, one they interpreted as threatening. And in an instant, the world went black. Gunshots echoed through the quiet neighborhood. Maria, standing by the window, screamed in terror. "No!" she cried as she watched her husband collapse to the ground. Blood pooled around him as the officers, now realizing their mistake, knelt beside him. Too late. Too late. Javier Ruiz, a man of no criminal intent, lay dead on the pavement. The days that followed were a blur of grief and confusion for Maria. The news reports that flooded the airwaves painted a different picture than the one Maria knew to be true. The police claimed that Javier had been a suspect in a robbery and had attempted to flee. They said he was armed and dangerous, and that's why they had to act so quickly. But Maria knew better. Javier wasn't a criminal. He had no history of violence. He was a family man, a hardworking father. His only crime was his appearance, and the fact that he fit a vague description from a police report. The community was torn. Some rallied behind the police, trusting in their judgment. Others, like Maria and her brother Carlos, were horrified by what had happened. They knew the truth, that an innocent man had been gunned down because of a tragic mistake, a case of mistaken identity. One person, however, refused to turn a blind eye. Sarah Morgan, an investigative journalist, began to dig deeper. As she sifted through the police reports, she found inconsistencies, glaring flaws in the story the officers were telling. The description of the suspect, vague at best, didn't match Javier in any meaningful way. The body camera footage from the scene? It had been lost, a technical glitch, they said. But Sarah didn't give up. She began to interview witnesses. One elderly woman, a neighbor who had seen the whole incident unfold from her window, was clear in her testimony. "He wasn't a threat," she said. "They just shot him for no reason." Sarah's investigation led her to Detective Alan Torres, a former cop who had left the force after becoming disillusioned with the system. Torres revealed the ugly truth. The police department was too quick to act, relying on assumptions and biases instead of facts. They made split-second decisions that too often turned deadly. The town became a battleground. Protests erupted in the streets as people demanded justice for Javier. His family, torn apart by grief and anger, stood at the forefront of the movement. Maria, her heart breaking, joined the protests, shouting for her husband's name to be cleared. Carlos, a military veteran, stood beside her, his fists clenched in determination. But the fight for justice wasn't just being fought on the streets. It was also being fought in the courtroom. Sarah, who had become a voice for the family, was now writing a book about Javier's case. She stood with Maria and Carlos in the courtroom, watching as the trial began. The defense lawyer argued that the police had acted in self-defense, that Javier had matched the description of a dangerous suspect, and that the officers had feared for their lives. But the prosecution pushed back, revealing the inconsistencies in the police's account. They showed the surveillance footage from a nearby store. footage that clearly showed Javier walking calmly toward his house with no threatening behavior. They argued that the officers had failed to follow proper procedures and that Javier had been killed because of a tragic mistake. The turning point came when Detective Torres took the stand. He spoke candidly about the systemic issues within the police force, the way officers were quick to pull the trigger, the way racial biases influenced their actions. His testimony exposed the truth. This was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern of negligence and failure. The jury deliberated, and the truth could no longer be denied. Months later, Javier was laid to rest. Maria stood at his grave, her heart shattered by the loss, but her resolve stronger than ever. She held Luis's hand tightly, her eyes filled with determination. Carlos stood beside her, his face grim but hopeful. "This fight isn't over," Carlos said quietly. "We have to keep going." And so they did. Sarah's book, The Wrong Man, became a powerful tool for change. It exposed the flaws in the system and the heartbreaking consequences of racism, bias, and police misconduct. It was a story of one man, one family, but also of a community that refused to stay silent in the face of injustice. Maria never gave up. She knew that Javier's death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a symbol of the many others who had suffered the same fate. Their names might be forgotten by the world, but they would not be forgotten by those who fought for justice. And as the protests continued, the fight for police reform gained strength. The world may have taken one life, but it had also ignited a movement that could not be silenced.